Hey, culty crew, it's Bubbles, your favourite true crime obsessed host, back with another episode of Cozy Cults and Crimes. How's everyone's week been so far? To be honest, I have been completely glued to the Olympics. I've been staying up till the very early hours here in Australia to be able to watch it, and watching Simone Biles do her stuff live is just so amazing to watch. I would also like to apologise if I sound a bit croaky this week. I'm getting over a bit of a pesky chest infection, feeling much better, but still got that bit of a rough voice, so I apologise. Just a bit of housekeeping before we dive into tonight's chilling episode. I want to give a huge shout out to one of my first YouTube subscribers, Vanessa Martinez. Thank you so much for your support and your kind words. It really does mean the world to me. And anyone else who's followed or subscribed to my YouTube channel or followed me on Instagram at cozy.cults.crimes. You guys are the absolute best. Your support helps me keep going with this. Now, believe it or not, it wasn't actually that long ago that I discovered the world of true crime myself. Back in 2021, when the whole world was stuck at home with COVID, I was also stuck at home recovering from thyroid surgery. I had way too much time on my hands and a couple of streaming subscriptions burning some holes in my pockets. I had exhausted all my normal comfort shows and all my normal movies, and then all of a sudden, like a sign from the universe, I actually stumbled upon a true crime doco about my very own hometown of Adelaide. I was shocked and intrigued and completely hooked. It was like discovering there was this hidden world right under my nose, a world of secrets, lies, and such twisted minds. And now, I'm the black sheep of the family when it comes to my true crime obsession. I'm so used to just seeing them roll their eyes when I start talking about one serial killer or another, or tell them about a new doco series about a cult gone wrong. Actually, I'm pretty sure my partner thinks there's something wrong with me. But I know that we're not alone in this. I know that there is a whole community of us out there, all drawn together by our shared fascination with the macabre. And speaking of the macabre, before we get started, a quick content warning. Tonight's episode is going to be a pretty heavy one. We'll be discussing graphic violence, murder, sexual assault, and other sensitive topics. So if you're not in the mood for a horror show, maybe save this one for later and grab a rom-com instead. But if you're ready to face the darkness with me, then let's get started. Now, if you've been following along with our little podcast journey, you might remember when we ventured into the gritty streets of 1970s New York City to uncover the terror inflicted by the Son of Sam. Well, tonight, we're staying in the same era, but we're shifting our focus a few years ahead to another predator who stalked those very streets, leaving a trail of unimaginable horror in his wake. We're going back to this dark and seedy underbelly of Times Square, where darkness danced with neon lights, a sinister predator lurked. His name was Richard Cottingham, but he would later become known as the Torso Killer. For years, he preyed upon vulnerable women, leaving behind a trail of dismembered bodies and shattered lives. Now guys, I want you to forget all about the Times Square you see today. All touristy and shiny, with Elmo and his friends all trying to sell you selfies. We're talking about the old Times Square, the one that was a little rough around the edges, a little dangerous, and a whole lot of seedy. This was the era of disco fever, platform shoes, and some seriously questionable fashion choices. But it was also a time of economic hardship, social unrest, and a crime wave that would make your head spin. The city was on the brink, teetering between the glitz and glamour of Studio 54 and the grime and grit of the streets. Times Square, in particular, was a hotbed of vice and violence. It was a place where dreams came to die, where the vulnerable were exploited, and where predators like Richard Cottingham could easily blend into the shadows. When I say Times Square was a seedy place, we're talking X-rated movie theatres, peep shows, and sex shops on nearly every corner. It was a place where danger lurked around every corner, where the line between pleasure and pain was almost always blurred. For women, especially those living on the margins of society, Times Square was a particularly dangerous place. They were easy targets for predators like Cottingham, who saw them as disposable, their lives worth less than the dirt beneath their feet. The city was practically drowning in a crime wave, with the NYPD struggling to keep up. The streets were overrun with gangs. Drugs were flowing freely, and violence was as common as pigeons in Central Park. It was a time of fear and uncertainty, a time when the city that never sleeps seemed to be having a collective nightmare. Alright crew, hold on to your hats because things are about to get seriously dark. It's December 1979 and a fire breaks out at the Travel Inn, a seedy little motel in the heart of Times Square. Firefighters rush to the scene, expecting the usual chaos and danger, but what they find inside is beyond their worst nightmares. In a smoke-filled room on 2 separate beds, they discover 2 women, but these aren't your average fire victims. They've been brutally murdered, their bodies dismembered, their heads and hands missing. One of the women, who was later identified as 22-year-old Didi Gudzari, the identity of this second victim, believed to be a teenage girl, remains unknown to this day. And to make matters worse, someone doused them in lighter fluid and set them ablaze. This gruesome discovery sent shockwaves through the city. Who could have committed such a heinous act, and why? The police are baffled, but one thing is clear. New York City had another monster on its hands. But in fact, this wasn't Cottingham's first rodeo. In fact, his first documented murder took place over a decade earlier, in 1967, in Lodi, New Jersey. Nancy Vogel, a 29-year-old mother of 2, was found strangled and sexually assaulted in her car. It was a crime that shocked the quiet suburban community of Lodi and left investigators puzzled. Little did they know that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would span over a decade and claim the lives of many more women. Over the next few years, Cottingham continued to prey on vulnerable women in New York and New Jersey. In 1972 and 1973, he murdered 2 young women, Lorraine Marie Kelly and Mary Ann Pryor, in similar circumstances. Their bodies were found in motel rooms, bearing the horrific marks of torture and mutilation. In 1977, Cottingham's violence escalated. He claimed 3 more victims: Valerie Ann Street, Jean Raymer, and Pamela Weisenfeld. Their bodies were found in various locations, all bearing the same gruesome signature: dismembered, often burned, and always missing their heads and hands. It was this signature mutilation that earned him the nickname the Torso Killer. The double homicide in Times Square in December of '79 was the culmination of years of escalating violence. It was a brazen and brutal act that sent a clear message. He was not afraid to kill. and he was not going to stop anytime soon. Women were terrified to walk the streets alone, especially in Times Square, where the killer seemed to be most active. The police were working tirelessly to catch him, but he always seemed one step ahead, leaving behind very few clues and no witnesses. It was a desperate race against time, a battle between good and evil, as the torso killer continued his reign of terror, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction that forever scarred the city of New York. But amidst this darkness and despair, a glimmer of hope was about to emerge. While the torso killer continued his reign of terror, the NYPD was not sitting idly by. They were under immense pressure to catch this monster, and they were determined to bring him to justice. The investigation was a long and arduous process, filled with dead ends and false leads, but the detectives never gave up. They tirelessly followed every tip, interviewed countless witnesses, and meticulously examined every shred of evidence they had, hoping to find a clue that would lead them to the killer. Can you just imagine, guys, the pressure those detectives were under? Every new discovery, each new dismembered body was a chilling reminder to them that a monster was loose on their streets, preying on unsuspecting women. The clock was ticking and they could hear it loud and clear. And the urgency to catch this depraved killer was mounting with every single day. For years, the police were absolutely stumped. I mean, the torso killer's MO was like something out of a horror movie. Like, Jesus, dismembered bodies, zero physical evidence, and victims seemingly chosen at random. It was like trying to catch a ghost, a phantom who just vanished into thin air after every gruesome act. The case blew up in the media, as they always do, with newspapers and magazines plastering lurid headlines and all the gory details all over their front pages. And as always, the public was hooked, a mix of horror and morbid curiosity swirling through the city. Everyone wanted to know who this monster was and when he would strike next. Tips came flooding in from every corner, but most of them led to dead ends. The torso killer was a master manipulator, covering his tracks like a pro. He was a chameleon, blending into society and leaving no trace of his true identity behind. But then in 1980, everything changed. A hotel maid heard a woman's screams echoing from one of the rooms. When the police burst in, they found Cottingham red-handed, with a victim who had been tortured and bound. It was like a scene from a nightmare, a chilling tableau of terror. Later, in his apartment, they found a treasure trove of twisted evidence. Handcuffs, a leather gag, and a collection of disturbing photographs of other women who had clearly endured unimaginable torment. The pieces of this puzzle were finally falling into place, and the torso killer's reign of terror was about to come crashing down. Cottingham was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and assault. But even then, he remained defiant, clinging to his innocence like a life raft. It wasn't until years later, after countless hours of interrogation and psychological evaluation, that he finally started to crack. In a series of bone-chilling interviews, Cottingham started to spill his guts, revealing the twisted depths of his depravity. He described his gruesome rituals, his sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain, and his complete lack of remorse. It was like listening to a horror show come to life, a glimpse inside a mind of a monster. So, my culty crime crew, after a reign of terror that lasted over a decade, Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, was finally behind bars. But as we all know, justice is a long and winding road, and this case was far from over. Turns out, Cottingham wasn't content to just fade away into obscurity. But what serial killer is? He craved attention, revelled in the notoriety. Like a twisted puppet master, he started to pull strings from his cell, confessing to a slew of other murders, cold cases that had haunted investigators for years. He spilled his guts to anyone who listened. Detectives, journalists, even other inmates. He'd recount his gruesome acts with a disturbing level of detail, as if he were bragging about his twisted trophies. It was a macabre performance, a desperate attempt to stay relevant, to keep the spotlight on himself. For the families of his victims, these confessions were a cruel twist of fate. On one hand, they finally did get some answers, some semblance of closure. But on the other hand, it was like ripping open old wounds, forcing them to relive the unimaginable pain and trauma all over again. But amidst the heartbreak, there was also a glimmer of hope. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, investigators were actually able to link Cottingham to a number of cold cases, giving names and faces to some of those unidentified victims. It was a bittersweet victory, a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice. But even with these breakthroughs, the story is far from over. The trauma inflicted by Cottingham's reign of terror continued to haunt the survivors and the families of his victims. They've had to endure unimaginable pain, their lives forever scarred by his monstrous acts. And for the women of New York City, especially those who lived and worked in Times Square during that era, the fear and paranoia lingered long after Cottingham was locked away. The streets they once knew became a battleground, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the shadows. But again, in the face of such darkness, there is always that glimmer of hope. The resilience of survivors, the tireless work of investigators, and the advancements in forensic science all offer a chance for healing, for closure, and for justice. My spooky squad, we've walked through the blood-soaked streets of Cottingham's crimes and witnessed the slow crawl of justice. But there is one question that keeps scratching at the back of my mind. What makes a monster? And look, I don't have any fancy psychology degree or anything like that. But I can't help but wonder what goes on inside the mind of a man like Richard Cottingham. What twisted thoughts, dark desires, and warped fantasies fueled the actions of this serial killer? How does one become so utterly devoid of empathy, so consumed by violence and depravity? It's a chilling question, but I think it's one you need to explore if we want to understand the true depths of human darkness. To unravel this enigma, we need to dig deep into the twisted roots of Cottingham's psyche. Now, I'm no armchair psychologist, but even I can see that this dude's childhood was a hot mess express. We're talking about a kid who grew up in a home filled with violence, neglect, and emotional turmoil. His dad was a raging alcoholic who beat him senseless, leaving him with physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. And his mum, well, she was emotionally checked out, leaving him feeling abandoned and unloved. To make matters worse, he was bullied relentlessly at school. his small stature and quiet demeanour making him an easy target. The constant humiliation and rejection fueled his anger and resentment, twisting his perception of the world and his place in it. But childhood trauma alone does not explain the depths of Cottingham's depravity. There had to be other factors at play, other demons lurking in the shadows of his mind. Now, experts have described Cottingham as a textbook psychopath, a man devoid of empathy and remorse, driven solely by his own twisted desires. He saw his victims as objects, mere playthings to satisfy his sadistic urges. He revelled in their pain and suffering, finding pleasure in their fear and helplessness. His crimes weren't just about sex or violence. They were about power and control. He enjoyed inflicting pain, both physically and emotionally, on his victims. It was his way of reclaiming the power he felt he had lost as a child, a way to assert his dominance over those he deemed weaker than himself. But the thing is, what sparked this descent into darkness? Was it the constant exposure to violence in his childhood? Was it the rejection and humiliation he had experienced in his personal relationships and at school? Or was it a combination of these factors? A perfect storm of trauma, genetics, and environmental influences that created the monster known as Richard Cottingham. Now, some experts believe that Cottingham's obsession with control and domination stemmed from his feelings of powerlessness as a child. Others point to his fascination with pornography and violence as a potential catalyst for his crimes. Still, others suggest a chemical imbalance in his brain may have contributed to his lack of empathy and remorse. Now, the truth is, we're never fully going to understand the complex web of factors that shaped Cottingham into the monster he ended up becoming. But by examining his life, his experiences, and his twisted psychology, we can gain a deeper understanding of the darkness that lurks within the human heart. Well, my culty crime crew, we've journeyed through the dark and twisted world of Richard Cottingham, the torso killer. We've uncovered the gruesome details of his crimes, explored the depths of his depraved mind, and witnessed the slow but steady pursuit of justice. It's been a bit of a harrowing journey, one that's left me feeling a bit disturbed and strangely fascinated. This case has forced me to confront the darkest corners of human nature, the capacity for evil that lurks within all of us. But it's also reminded me of the resilience of the human spirit, the unwavering pursuit of justice, and the importance of remembering the victims, those whose lives were tragically cut short by Cottingham's monstrous acts. This case is a stark reminder that evil exists in our world, but so does good. It's a reminder that we must remain vigilant, support survivors of violence, and never give up the fight for justice. And with that, my spooky soul squad, I know these true crime stories can get a bit heavy. They can weigh on your heart and your mind, leaving you feeling overwhelmed or even a bit triggered. And you know what? That's okay. It's important to acknowledge those feelings and to take care of yourselves. If you're struggling with the darkness of this case or any other difficult emotions, please reach out for help. If you're in Australia, you can call Lifeline Australia at 13 11 14. They're available 24/7 to provide crisis support and any suicide prevention services. For my international listeners, Befrienders Worldwide is a global network of crisis centres that offer emotional support to those who are struggling to cope. You can find their contact information at befrienders.org. And hey, speaking on mental health, I want to be real with you guys for a second. I'm going to be honest, I have dealt previously with my own mental health struggles, and I still do. It's taken me a long time to realise though that it's okay for me not to be okay. I still have to remind myself that every day, but it's okay. Sometimes, in a weird way, I find true crime actually a really good distraction from what's going on inside my head. It's like it gives my brain something else to focus on, a way to escape from my own thoughts and feelings, even just for a little while. I know it might sound strange, but it works for me. And if you find comfort or distraction in true crime too, that's okay. But it is important to remember that it's not a substitute for professional help if we need it. Now, as we close this chapter on the torso killer, I'm left with a mix of emotions. Sadness, anger, disgust, but also a sense of gratitude for the brave investigators who tirelessly pursued this case, and the survivors who shared their stories, giving a voice to the voiceless. And with that, my culty crime crew, we've come to the end of another episode. It's been a rough one this week, but it's okay. We got through it together, and here we are. As always, my culty crime crew, remember to stay safe, stay spooky, and never lose sight of the light in the darkness. Thank you for tuning in, my culty crew. I'm Bubbles, and I can't wait to welcome you back next time for another journey into the shadowy yet strangely comforting world of cozy cults and crimes. I'll see you next time. Bye!